Well, hello, kids. This is our podcast called The Spanish-American War. It's on our unit known as imperialism, where America's starting to really spread out and take over across the world. I guess we've spread out across as much of our own country as we can, so now it's time to go across the oceans, if necessary. And this Spanish-American War, Section 2 in your book, yes, it's a war between Spain and America. That is true. However, the question is, where is it fought? And as you're sitting there, I hope you're thinking, do I know where the Spanish-American War is fought? How have I ever heard of the Spanish-American War? Well, it definitely was between Spain and the U.S. However, it was not in either of those countries. It actually happened in Cuba. And I'm hoping that you can see a mental map of where Cuba is. But in case you can't, you know me, I'm going to show you. So why the heck is the Spanish and American War being fought in Cuba? Well, it goes back to the old days of imperialism when Spain, over yonder here in Europe, had control of Cuba. It was a territory of Spain. Actually, it dates back to 1492, whenever crazy Chris Columbus, sailed the ocean blue and took Cuba as a colony for Spain. So ever since then, it's been in Spanish control, and Spain was in its power in 1500s, 1600s, but after that they really started to die down, and Britain and France really started to pick it up and take their spot. So by this point in history, Spain's going to be weaker by the 20th century. Well, the reason we're talking about Cuba in the first place is lots of Americans did business. They made their money in Cuba selling products, which we'll mention in a second here. But by the way, this is not a magic continent that you didn't know about. This is just a little zoom in on Cuba. This is Cuba down here, kids, in case you weren't sure. It is the closest country to America besides Mexico and Canada. Only, I think, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So why are we there? Well, it is a great place for trade. It's so close to the Gulf of Mexico, which is part of our country's border. And also, the reason we're there is because we're buying tons and tons and tons, literally, I mean tons of sugar. We love sugar. And in fact, as a result of the Caribbean and Cuba, all of Europe loves loves sugar. And it's actually interesting, if you look at old records from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, whenever 1500s, when Europeans began buying sugar that was made in the great climate of the Caribbean, which you need this warm, moist climate for sugar to grow. The dentistry rates went off the charts. The people with teeth problems over in Europe, it was a big issue for them. So you can imagine. The dentists made lots of money from then on, I'm sure. But we invested all kinds of money, our businessmen, in their mines and railroads and the sugar plantations. So these businessmen aren't going to want to let that money go to waste. And this is one of our earliest examples in this class of how money really all comes down to money. Like, why do we go to war? Unfortunately, a lot of it is because of money. So let's see here, going way back. Spain had owned Cuba for centuries, like I said, and they were making tons of money from Cuba. That's the purpose of a territory or a colony, is to make money. It's not to become friends with the locals. I mean, you could kind of lie and say that's the reason, but usually it's not the reason. And many of the Cubans had been slaves to the Spanish in the past, old-fashioned slaves. But now that they were given their freedom a couple hundred years ago, but they weren't really all that much better off, even though they weren't actually slaves. Yes, they could move around, but where are you going to go? What kind of job are you going to get? So they didn't have much freedom, and they couldn't have their own government. They had to do what the Spanish told them to do. So they were very unhappy, much like we were unhappy when the British controlled us in America back in the 1760s, 1770s. So we're getting close to war. This guy, Jose Marti, I love saying his name, Jose Marti. He's probably the third coolest name of the year so far. He was a Cuban guerrilla fighting against the Spanish authorities. Guerrilla, that word guerrilla. I believe guerra means war in Spanish, and the suffix ia means, I believe, small. So it's like a small war, small soldier, something along those lines. But he's fighting against the Spanish authorities, and after this rebellion. The Cubans had a rebellion against the Spanish. It didn't work. 1878. He had to flee. He had to run away for his life. He had to run to the United States, and he stayed there for however many years. I think New York City. He set up camp there. But he was known as a poet, and he wrote about Cuba's problems and the mean Spanish and how they were being so cruel to them. And while he's in America writing his poetry and becoming really well known about the Cuban problems, he raises tons of money and weapons, and he helps train troops for someday when they can come back and return and fight. So we're getting closer. This is President Grover Cleveland. Fun fact: he was the only U.S. president to be president twice, but not consecutively. There's a president in between him. You can look up why that was, what happened. But he declared us neutral. He said, just so you know, everyone, we're neutral. We're not picking sides here. However, these two guys were not neutral. They wanted war. The problem was they were actually Americans. See if you recognize their names: William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. I don't know if any of those names sound familiar to you. Maybe you've heard of the Pulitzer Prize, which is awarded to journalists. Is that what you were guessing, journalists? And Hearst still owns the owner of the Hearst Corporation, as in not Hearst like for dead people. I'm talking about the magazine company. They still some ridiculous percentage of newspapers and magazines are still owned by the Hearst Corporation. So check your local newspaper. Yeah, they're both newspaper writers, or I should say editors, owners. So they are actually wanting war, and they're called yellow journalists. That's this new concept back then in the late 1800s, where U.S. newspapers are printing these crazy stories, these exaggerated stories. They're not exactly true. They're mostly true, but they're a little exaggerated, to try to get to sell newspapers. And these guys were competitors. William Randolph Hearst, was a competitor of Pulitzer, and they wanted to sell more newspapers than the other guys, so they would print ridiculous stories. So, I mean, nowadays, we're totally used to this. We're used to seeing big, bold headlines, exclamation point at the end. We see it every time we're at the grocery store, at the magazines, but back then it was something new. So, this guy known as the Butcher, General Valeriano Weyler from Spain. When you have the nickname the Butcher, it's usually not a good thing. I couldn't imagine, unless you are actually a butcher, which he wasn't. This man is a butcher. This was not an actual picture of the Butcher from 1890s, believe it or not. But this guy, the Butcher, the reason he was known as the Butcher, he was Spanish, obviously. He had to show the Cubans who's boss, right? So he herds the Cubans into these concentration camps, or they called them reconcentration camps, like reconcentrating them into separate areas, because they were getting out of control. They kept leading these rebellions, and the Spanish didn't like it. So, the word concentration camp I'm assuming makes you think of the Holocaust, World War II, Adolf Hitler. Yeah, same thing. Moving people into camps so that you can keep an eye on them. Well, same thing. Disease spread. We're talking a tropical environment here, so disease spread, unsanitary conditions, and tens of thousands of these Cubans are killed in these camps. So it's pretty bad story. This doesn't look good. Those yellow journalists grab a hold of the story, and they're printing newspaper articles left and right about it. And Americans are getting all upset about these poor Cubans. Let's help them. Now McKinley doesn't like it. He says, Spain, listen, we've got to talk about this, right? Spain replies, okay, fine. Okay, big, strong America, let's make a deal here. How about we get rid of the Butcher? Okay, we'll send him back to Spain. And how about we give the Cubans their own government, kind of, but they'll still be part of our empire. Well, sound like a good deal. What do you think? What do you think, Jose? Deal or no deal? Well, how about no deal? Viva la Cuba, of course. No deal, of course. That's not good enough, he says. We want total freedom. We don't want to be a colony any longer. So now things are heating up. The U.S. is going to send one of our battleships, the USS Maine. I'm going to say that name again, the USS Maine, to the coast of Cuba, just in case things get messy. Plus, if something does break out, we want to make sure that we can evacuate our Americans. Businessmen that are there. We got to protect American lives. So in case anything goes wrong. Well, let's fast forward a little bit, shall we? There are actually two sparks that cause the U.S. to declare war on Spain. And the first one is going to be this mysterious letter, the Spanish ambassador's letter that criticizes President McKinley. It's called the Delome letter. That's his name, Delome. And in this letter, he writes it about the president back home, back to Spain, and he makes fun of McKinley. He said he was weak and he was a bitter for the admiration of the crowd, meaning he just wanted to say whatever people wanted to hear, and he was not a good president. So, you know, I don't care what your politics are, but if someone talks bad about our president from another country, it's going to be bad. And the other spark that led us to declare war was that ship we talked about, the USS Maine. Yeah, it's going to go kablooey in Havana Harbor, which is right off the capital city of Cuba. So that's the preview. That's the heads up. Here's a nice drawing of that Maine blowing up and bodies are flying through the air. That's pretty impressive. I'm not sure if it looked like that or not. What happened? This is a catastrophe. Here's pictures of the wreckage being pulled up from the ocean floor. The harbor was pretty shallow, so I guess they were able to actually pull up the wreckage and try to investigate what happened. Well, of course, people want to know. Those yellow journalists want to know who did this. They demanded to have some answers, right? Well, they blamed Spain right off the bat. Of course, it was those evil Spanish. Look, that's how they are. That's what they do. And the people reading these articles become outraged, and they say, "We want war." And like this slogan, "Remember the Maine," was put all over newspapers, turned into songs. "Remember the Maine, remember the Maine." You know, just like after 9/11, people said, "Never forget 9/11." Well, same kind of deal. Remember the Maine. All those sailors that lost their lives. This time period is known as a period of jingoism, Great Jingoism. This is a vocab word that means an attitude of aggressive nationalism. So not just like I'm proud to be an American, but like I'm really, really proud to be an American, and I will beat you up if you're not feeling the same way I am. Jingoism. You actually hear that a decent amount here and there in newspapers, TV, when you're talking about the country. So before you know it, April 1898, the U.S. and Spain are at war, and it's on. So the Spanish-American War has officially begun in April of 1898. Oh, see if you can figure out what these sentences say. Use Google Translator. Give you an extra credit point if you look up what they say, what they mean. Picture of the war. Notice the soldier, 1898. This is kind of a cross between the uniforms of the Civil War plus and then World War I. They have the hats of World War I. We're actually going to take a break here, and I will see you in class, and we'll go over the rest together in class.